to everyone to the virtual BSR. My name is Harriet O'Neill and I'm Assistant Director for the Fine Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you all, as I said, to the latest instalment of the Violence and Fascism series. And we're very grateful to our research fellow, Simon Martin, who's doing so much to organising this series of seminars. And it's actually brilliant to hear him as a panelist tonight. So I am going to hand over to John Foote to give more detailed introductions, and it just remains for me to say that this event is being recorded and that you can consult all the previous episodes on our website under the YouTube channel. So thank you very much to our speakers, thank you very much to our audience, and I shall hand over to John. Thank you.
Hello, thank you very much, Harriet, and thanks to BSR and to Simon for putting this together. So our subject today is Fascist Martyrs, and we're kind of broadly sticking to 1921, but we'll move around between different time periods. During the rise of fascism and once fascism was in power, a number of fascist martyrs emerged who were supposedly fascists who died particularly in the period of 1919 to 21. And they were officially named according to the fascism itself. There was something like 3,000 of these, although that number is heavily contested. And these martyrs were celebrated and commemorated throughout the regime, and then to some extent afterwards. We might get to that as well. They were extremely important for the propaganda and the commemoration, and also the memory in particular of the Red period after the First World War. There hasn't actually, for many a long time, there wasn't actually that much historical research into the martyrs, despite their importance under fascism, but that's changed massively in recent years. And the three people we've got today have worked on various aspects of memory of the First World War, of fascism, and specifically on fascist martyrs. So I'm delighted to welcome three historians to talk about this subject today, and we're going to use the same format we have in the other events, which is a very kind of informal kind of chat conversation about this subject, not formal papers. So first we've got Hannah Malone, who's a historian who has worked widely on architecture and the connection between architecture, politics, fascism and memory, and is currently assistant professor of contemporary history at the University of Groningen. And her publications and research you can see in the more extensive bio on the invite that you got to this event. Amy King is lecturer in liberal arts at the University of Bristol, and she works specifically on secular martyrs, has worked specifically on secular martyrs in Italy. She her PhD and was on transnational martyrs, particularly on Matteotti, but she's also worked in a number of other areas and is currently writing a book on the 1973 Rogo di Primavera in Rome, which is an extraordinary event that I'm sure hopefully we'll get to talk about a bit today, perhaps towards the end. And Simon Martin is a historian who has worked largely on sports, but also increasingly on fascism and memory. He's published some seminal works on Italian sport, which are widely read. And he's currently working on a book on the myth, memory, and meaning of the fascist martyr Giovanni Berta, to be published in 2022 by La Terza. Today is the 28th of October. This event was not organised because it's the 28th of October. But I think it would be a bit weird to not acknowledge that it's the 28th of October, the anniversary of the March on Rome. So it's a strange coincidence, but that's the way it's turned out. So I'll go to Hannah, then Amy, then Simon for a kind of first round. Perhaps you could talk about your research and your interest in this area.
Yes, thanks, John and Harriet, for that introduction, and to Simon for organising. Well, my specific interest in fascist martyrdom is that I'm writing a book on the military ossuaries, the Sacrari Militari of the First World War, these large constructions where fallen soldiers of the First World War were reburied under fascism as part of a campaign of propaganda in the name of martyrdom. And I came to this topic essentially by following a series of dead bodies because I'd worked before on the martyrs of the Risorgimento, some of whom were also exhumed and reburied under fascism. So I followed them in time. So that's my interest.
I want to hear about those, Hannah, the exhumed risorgimento martyrs. Thanks, John and Harriet, for the introduction. So I came to this through my PhD, which, as John mentioned, looked at secular martyrdom in Italy. I did two case studies, one of which was Giacomo Matteotti, who was the sort of competing martyr cult, which hopefully we can kind of draw out in our discussions, murdered in 1924 by men associated with Mussolini's regime, and then looked at the commemoration of those who died during the Rogo di Primavalle, so an arson attack on a family linked to the post-fascist party, the Movimento Sociale Italiano, and they're very much commemorated even today as martyrs, and kind of recontextualized within a kind of broader pantheon of fascist martyrs that begins with what we'll be talking about today. But I've also worked recently on transnational fascist martyrs, so looking at those who died abroad and how the repatriation of their bodies and the dual funerals in the place of death, and indeed back in Italy, helped to build a sense of imperial expansion under Mussolini's regime.
Okay, well, thanks to everybody. Thanks to particularly to Hannah and Amy for participating in this evening. I'm kind of a bit new to martyrdom, so I might have to defer to our two experts here on certain things. But I came into this through through my PhD work on football, effectively. Giovanni, as John said, I'm writing this book now on the life or death and afterlife, should I say, of Giovanni Berta. And I met Berta, so to speak, because it was the name of the fascist stadium in Florence. So Fascism constructed a new stadium in Florence. This is one of the key kind of aspects of my PhD work many years ago. And it struck me about the stadium, it was very much a kind of a sideline in many ways for the thesis, but there was the name of the stadium, the Stadio Giovanni Berta, and I had a look at who it was, and he was a martyr, and it had quite an interesting story attached to it. And he was a martyr because he had been attacked by communists on a bridge in Florence, and had apparently hung from the bridge, and at which point the communists chopped his hands off and he fell into the Arno. And this was the story that was associated with the stadium. And in my innocence, I don't know, and I kind of repeated the story, which I think most people, there are very few accounts of Giovanni Berta looking, historically, and most people tend to repeat that story as I did. But it kind of stuck with me. And then coming to live in Rome some years later, and also traveling around Italy, I began to see many references to him, perhaps which we'll come back to. But particularly in Rome, I came across there are drain covers across Rome with from the fonderia, from the foundry, the iron foundry Giovanni Berta, which also had the symbol of fascism, the fasces on them. And these are littered all over the city. There are still a few left in Florence. And I guess I started to ask myself about these drain covers, but about fascist material culture in general. Why was it still here? I haven't strictly got an answer to that. It's a big question, but I mean, that's really kind of what I've been working on. But I've been trying to look at that partly through this story and this afterlife of Giovanni Berta. His afterlife is in many ways a lot more exciting than his life itself.
Thank you, all of you. So we can see where you're coming from different directions and into different stories. And I agree that these stories are absolutely fascinating and often very surprising. And they're not quite what you expect. I've looked at a few of them around some of the more minor martyrs. So perhaps we could start by thinking, all of you, I could ask you to think about for a little bit about what a martyr is and why some martyrs become famous, as it were, and some don't. And a kind of sort of connected question is there something specifically Italian about this use of martyrs, or is it something that you find in many political eras and contexts? So we can go in the same order.
Yes, that is a very good question. What is a fascist martyr? Because of course no one is born a martyr. Someone becomes a martyr, is made a martyr. And I think martyrs are made through narrative, through stories, through what Simon was saying, these tales of bloody and violent death, and that is what constitutes a martyr. But I think fascist martyrs could be defined as someone who died for the fascist cause. And then within that broad category, there are a number of subcategories: the martyrs of the fascist revolution, who died in the initial struggle for power between 1919 and 1922. And then we have other categories of fascist martyrs that creep in later on into the rhetoric of the regime. We have the heroes of the Risorgimento, the fallen soldiers of the First World War, and then Italian soldiers who died fighting for Italy in colonial expeditions, Spanish Civil War, and then the Second World War. So that is quite a broad category, but I think what very much unites them are these tales of martyrdom that serve a very specific political purpose, that do something for fascism. And perhaps this is something we can explore more.
Yeah, completely agree. So this is, I think, about, they're almost manufactured, aren't they? You don't, as you say, Hannah, die a martyr, but you're kind of commemorated in the narrative, whether that's a concrete narrative in a monument or in a verbal one. I think what's really fascinating about martyrdom, as opposed to victimhood, for example, or any of the other categories we might think about, is that martyrs sort of exert a power from the grave that they might not have exerted at the time of their, during their lives. And Simon mentioned that Berta, for example, had a less exciting life than he did, death or posthumous tale. But this idea that to remember someone as a martyr is to kind of contextualize them within part of a broader political struggle, which might be real or imagined. And the other thing that I think is fascinating about martyrdom is that the term itself sort of shines a spotlight on both the individual, but also the person that kills the individual and thus creates the martyr, a way to sort of underline the barbarity often of the enemy. And I think we really see that with Giovanni Berta, who Simon, I'm sure, will talk about, and I don't want to speak about him much, but just so much of his commemoration was on the violence of having his fingers chopped off, really emphasizing that sort of communist violence there. So yeah, power from the grave, but also putting emphasis on the barbarity of the enemy, I think, is what is quite unique to martyrdom as opposed to victims, for example.
Yeah, again, I obviously agree with all of that. I think what I would add, and I think in many ways, I'm not sure that, I think almost anybody can be a martyr, in the sense that I think it is that issue about the narrative. So I think anybody who can be manipulated, or whose story can be manipulated and used to fit the narrative, and the fascist narrative especially, can be used. So it doesn't actually matter whether they are or whether they aren't. And that's the kind of the big question with Berta is in many ways about his allegiance or not. But I don't think in many ways it's really the key issue. The key issue is about how that narrative, how that story gets told, and what it's designed to do. So I think what it is designed to do, John, you asked sort of why are they so famous? Why is he famous? I think it's part of creating a common experience. It's about identity, creating something that lots of people can associate with. It's about what Amy mentioned there as well, about demonizing the opposition. I mean, this is something that I find myself repeating and actually trying to cut, because I talk about it far too much in the book, constantly, over and over and over. It's the repetition in lots of different ways of the barbarity of the opponent, and about persecution, which then takes us back into sort of old historic ideas of martyrdom as well. So about persecution, about maybe defying that, but ultimately about fitting the narrative, I think, to create fitting the fascist narrative, to create a story that can mass mobilize effectively, that can unite people. I think that's what they do. But their actual, whether they are martyrs, I don't think in many ways is a bit of a red herring in some ways.
Yeah, maybe I could add a couple of things there. I think one thing is that Hannah really already made this point, but just to underline, you don't have to be a fascist to be a fascist martyr. And whether Berta was a fascist is debatable, but there are also many others who are clearly not fascists. Probably the first one of all is a man called Judo Gildani, who was killed in Bologna in November 1920. And he's not a fascist, he's a liberal nationalist. He never joined the fascist party, was never, I mean, you know, there were some things in common, but he was killed in the council chamber of in extraordinary events of November 1920. And what the fascists do incredibly well, perhaps I'll come back to you, all of you on this, was appropriate events and tell stories about them very quickly. So Giordani's funeral it was organized by the fascists. And then he becomes a fascist martyr, even though he's not a fascist. And that happens time and again. And the other example that I've looked at in detail is what happened in Empoli in 1921, when 9 soldiers are killed by the crowd because people think they're fascist or they aren't. And they are immediately appropriated as fascist martyrs, even though, again, they were never fascists, or probably none of them were. So are we really talking about an incredibly potent propaganda machine, or is there something else going on in that particular period that creates the space for these fascist martyrs? How did the fascism kind of come across this way of organizing things, do you think? So there's a couple of questions there that might go round again on those.
Yes, if I can come in on that point, how did fascism land on this particularly powerful political tool? Well, I think undoubtedly they are adopting models that are specifically Italian, that set their roots in traditions of Italian nationalism, dating back to the 19th century, to the Risorgimento on one hand, and then on the other hand, of course, to Catholic models. So they're speaking a language that is familiar to at least a portion of the Italians, which makes it easily graspable, easily understandable. And the fascists are thereby adapting these traditions, grafting on to these older traditions, drawing cultural capital from them. So I think initially they were taking this tool and then developing it once there was this realization of how powerful this tool could be, as Simon said, as an instrument of mobilization, of uniting, a way to also ennoble a cause, very much so. And we see this tool developing through the course of fascism. But I think it was fortunate that there was a tool to hand within the Italian tradition that was so well suited to fascism because of its connection with violence, with ideas of regeneration and rebirth, ideas of a specifically Italian tradition that could be easily adopted and transformed to their specific political needs.
I think one of the other things that's really interesting about this is that, as John says, they mobilize very quickly in many cases to quickly honor individuals as martyrs who died through violence, but they also play the longer game in terms of, in the 1930s, when we see the construction of these mausoleums for fascist martyrs really kind of explode. Lots of people who didn't die through fascist violence are then re-exhumed and reburied in these sacrari as if they had died for fascist violence. So I'm thinking of Inez Donati, who we could talk more about because she's also notable for being a female martyr, but she died of tuberculosis, but she had been prominent because she knew Mussolini. She'd taken part in the March on Rome. She was quite a well-known figure, but they'd built this mausoleum in the Verano cemetery that had more spaces than it did bodies, so she was exhumed and reburied in there. So as well as responding very quickly, as you say, John, they also really kind of take the long view and remember the figures that already had some interest and support and recontextualize them within these spaces of martyrdom as they appear in the cities.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that really is, and to come back to your original point there, John, I think that the propaganda element is quite important. I think something that we've talked about a lot throughout this series is the role of the press. And so I think particularly initially, even in this period that we're looking at, sort of 1919, 2021, we see this explosion of fascist press as well. Even these small single broadsheets. So there's a great mouthpiece. I think it sells copy for sure. But I would come back to this idea about the demonization of the opposition. I think it's something that is absolute, for me, it's absolutely critical. It's this tool to dehumanize socialism and communism, and the media and the press is fundamental in that. And then obviously as censorship comes in the mid-1920s, then there's a lot more control over that story as well, and it can be directed and used in particular ways. So I think in the case of Berta, I think there are lots of when I first started this, I was kind of looking for almost half expecting to find a smoking gun of his family having put a lot of money into this, and they don't really seem to have a huge, I mean, they are involved, but they don't seem to have a huge amount to do with it. It seems to me that it was more issues about local and national rivalries, that he becomes a Florentine hero. And so this is a means by which the Florentine party can associate its radical nature. It can defend its radical nature. It can defend its independence from the National Party. But at the same time, he's a very, very useful figure for the National Party as well. He's the fascist of the first hour. He's not the first martyr, as you said, but he kind of comes across as he's always portrayed as the first martyr. He's portrayed as the #1 martyr. So I think he also has there is a benefit for everybody within the fascist movement. He's applicable to everybody, so he becomes a very, very useful figure at different times in the regime as well.
Thank you again. Perhaps press you all on a bit more on the question of memory. So just I'd link up to this with a story. I was in Bolzano years ago working on divided memory for my book on divided memory, and came across this incredible frieze, which was actually finished in the 1950s, I later found, which is one of the most weirdest stories about fascist architecture in Italy. In the middle of this frieze, there's a guy hanging from a bridge. And I didn't know who that was. It didn't have any names on it or anything. And that's Berta, I later found out. So it's kind of instantly recognizable. The bridge itself, as Simon knows, was, well, I don't know if it's the actual bridge, but a bridge was included in the Mostra della Rivoluzione Fascista in Rome. Inside there's a whole martyr bit, which we could talk about as well. Like these kind of relics of the martyrs, Cimelli. They have the desk where Gildani is shot there. I mean, massive things, not tiny things. So, I mean, could we have a think? Amy's raised it, Hannah's raised it, and then Simon's raised it. Could we think a bit more about the memory? And this kind of leads us to a later question, which maybe we won't do now, but maybe thinking about what happens to these things in 43 or 45. But does the memory become institutionalized? Are these national figures by the 30s? And are they serving a different purpose then than they were serving in, say, 25, 26? So are they different in 35, 36 when they're in statues than they were in 25, 26? That's a series of questions. Answer any of them you want, or say anything you want about memory.
Perhaps I might say a few words about the evolution in the concepts of fascist martyrdom. This representation of killed figures as martyrs emerges in a bottom-up spontaneous way in the early years of the ascendancy of fascism, 1919 to 1921. And then we see it evolve into an official ideology of the fascist regime. And that is where it becomes very much institutionalized, especially as Amy mentioned, with the creation of shrines of martyrs that pop up in various locations across the country in the 1930s. And I think a crucial change in the figure of the fascist martyr is, first of all, the inflation of the numbers. And this was mentioned before, how initially they were estimated at a couple of hundred, and then they become a couple of thousand through some very generous accounting of counting anyone who fell ill, was injured, was present, non-fascist. The numbers are just massively, artificially inflated. So that's one element. The second element in the evolution of ideas of fascist martyrdom is the way the original fascist martyrs of the fascist revolution, of the initial struggle, are then mixed together with these other categories we have been talking about. Fallen soldiers of the First World War, for instance, Italian soldiers, and how the boundaries start to be very blurred through these different categories. And they get blurred in very practical ways, such as by burying them together, as is, for instance, the case at Bologna in the Certosa cemetery. And Amy mentioned this and how clever it is to bury such figures together, because it's a clever way, again, to boost the numbers and to appropriate martyrs who had died before fascism as deaths for the fascist cause, retrospectively claim them. So these are 2 points.
Yeah, I agree with what Hannah's just been saying, and what we can really see is the incorporation of fascist martyrs into the existing pantheon of national secular martyrs that, Risorgimento of World War I, and through combining the bodies in the same space, the sort of fascistization, is that a word in English? It is in Italian, of those national deaths. So sort of two different things going on in those spaces. But I think another thing that's really interesting about how it develops is it really becomes part of everyday life under the fascist regime, right? As far as I know, but correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's one day to commemorate the fascist martyrs. Rather, I think that it's incorporated into all other events, So these are kind of mass participatory events, funerals, commemorative marches for individuals. But then when you have huge fascist ceremonies to celebrate other things, there's usually a bit at the end where there's a roll call of, fascist martyrs and a kind of that call and response thing of shouting their names and people saying presente. And then the incorporation of chapels into bigger fascist buildings like the Case del Fascio. So it becomes part of the broader fascist infrastructure and commemorative culture in general, rather than being these isolated moments of people's day-to-day lives. It's really, on a broad scale, something that people are encountering a lot in their day-to-day existences.
The development, I think, John, the Bolzano bas-relief there is quite it's quite spectacular, and I mean, it is interesting from what you say that it gets completed in 1950. But yes, it is better there. It's quite, I think if you look at it, it's quite, there are lots of images produced of him, and they do vary. So I think this is also something, perhaps there's something going on with the images, which I tried to look at. There are a number of postcard images, so mass-produced images of him, which are produced, and they vary. So sometimes they're of him, a couple of them are of him as an adolescent, maybe sort of about 15, 16 years old. He's about 26, something like that when he dies. There are lots of different interpretations of him. I think something we can certainly come back to as well. But the thing what always distinguishes them, and what makes that quite clear on that relief, is that he's often the background, or you get the X of the parapet of the bridge, which is always seems to be that is the bridge that identifies him. So even if you're not sure, there are a couple of examples of him, and it's quite clearly there's no reference to, there's no clear presentation of him as he was. But there's the bridge, and you just see, and it can be, there's one which comes to mind of an old stone bridge. So the Ponte Sospeso was a kind of, a metal suspension bridge. It wasn't made of stones, but upon the top, you've got the crossed railings, which identifies it. And those are the railings which are taken to the Mostra del Decennale. In 1934, they have one in Florence. They have an exhibition dedicated to the gemelli of Giovanni Berta. Specifically where they take, obviously, the bridge as well. So I think the material culture side, well, using that term very, very loosely. The various reliefs, there are numerous busts made of him. The naming, the topographical issue, I think the naming around him as well. I mean, he has a naval ship named after him. There's a town in Libya named after him. The stadium, as I said, numerous streets in Italy, which we can come back to perhaps at the end. So his name gets divulged widely in lots of different ways, but art particularly as well. It becomes there are some quite serious Italian artists. There's a representation of him which is very, very interesting in 1936 at the Biennale in Venice. Again, I think we can maybe come back to him because he's portrayed as a Christ-like figure. I mean, it's a crucifixion. He's not Berta. He's quite clearly Christ. So the material culture, I think, is really, really, really important in the way that this myth gets developed and the way it gets maintained. We had last time, if I'm not wrong, Christina Baldassini, and she was talking about the periodization of fascism, and I think it really works, certainly with Berta, because I think that he works in different ways at different times. So he works locally and nationally. Early on, he's a great symbol of fascismo della prima ora, of the first hour. So the radical kind of idealism of fascism. Again, we probably need to think about whether he was or why he might not have been a fascist, but he is portrayed as this fascist of the first hour. So he symbolizes the purity of the revolution. Then that takes us into the rise of fascism and the sort of defeat of communism. So the demonization of the opposition. I think there's a change in the kind of late 20s, early 30s with the sort of going to the people campaign. He sort of re-emerges again. So in the press in the mid 30s, you start to see a lot more of him again. So I think it's about mass mobilization. And he comes out in the sort of from the mid 30s and into the war years. So 30 from the colonial war and then into the Second World War. So even in sort of 42, 43, these are quite niche examples of fascist press, but he becomes this kind of bugle cry for fascism of la prima ora, for the ideals of fascism. He's permanently a mobilizing agent in different times, in different ways. So I think the periodization of fascism is quite important in terms of the way that his story develops, but the way that it also gets maintained.
Amy, do you want to come back on that?
Yeah, one just last point on the kind of development in terms of timing that I think is really important is that there's one other great group in Italy who are very much pros at the propaganda around martyrs in a secular sense, and that's the Socialists. That's very much part of kind of international socialist culture, honouring people as, martyrs, with the religious iconography, all of the rhetoric that we're used to with secular martyrs. And of course, in 1924, they get their best one in Giacomo Matteotti, who is commemorated with the language and the rituals of martyrdom globally, within Italy, of course, as well. And that's a real tension point for the fascists as it turns to dictatorship, with people flocking to the site of his death and real pilgrimages. But he becomes this sort of counterpoint, this oppositional secular martyr. And I read stories of people having images in their houses, paintings of Mussolini on one side that they would then flip round. So Matteotti on one side, and Mussolini on the other, and they would flip it around depending on who was in the house. So there's this great kind of martyr propaganda war going on between the fascists and the anti-fascists that extends around the world.
Simon?
Yeah, just Amy brings up the socialist side. I think it's very important. I think it takes us back originally to what we was talking about at the beginning as well, about why this takes off, because I think there is this kind of there's almost a national tradition. It's something that people understand. And so in terms of Berta's story, that the attack upon him comes after the murder of Spartaco Lavagnini, the night before. So the socialist or the communist trade unionist who gets brutally murdered, brutally shot, and then put back in his editor's chair, and his lit cigarette replaced in his mouth. And so when they find him, the sort of cigarette is burnt down. And so a brutal story, but he becomes also a great socialist martyr as well. So I agree completely with what Amy's saying there. And I think it does take us, when you asked the question at the beginning about, where does this martyrdom come from? I think it's already there, and all sides are using it as a political tool.
Absolutely. And just a couple of things to add. Firstly, I think there's on the periodization, there's also periodization of kind of institutionalization of the place. So the churches start to have these sacrari inside or next to the church. The most famous one is Santa Croce, which is also the place of kind of national memory. And it's kind of amazing that the church hands over part of its space to these secular martyrs. And they build these special crypts, and that's been quite extensively studied, I think, in various articles, like Siena, Florence, and other places. So that's a kind of concrete place that's not in a cemetery; it's in a church or side of a church or in a crypt. The other thing, of course, that's worth kind of mentioning on a kind of more banal level, perhaps, is that having a martyr in the family was quite a useful thing, because this meant money, meant housing, probably pension, prestige, jobs. So, the inflation of the number of martyrs is also kind of linked up to that. In Bologna, there's a quartieri dei famiglia or dei martiri, where you can actually get a house if you're linked up to. So this is part of the kind of patronage state of fascism, which is connected to the people who went to the March on Rome, which also inflates constantly if you officially went to the March on Rome, so that number goes up, and then the martyrs themselves go up. I wanted to come to gender for a bit, if we can, which is obviously crucial here. Amy mentioned inestonati, but are there issues around gender, masculinity, that we can draw out from looking at these martyrs and their histories?
If I might say a few words on gender, which I think is really crucial to the identity of the fascist martyr. As Amy mentioned, the fascist martyrs are overwhelmingly male. Cases of female martyrdom beyond inestonati, I really can't think of any. And I think there are perhaps two reasons for that. The first being that martyrs are role models, they are exemplars of fascist ideals. And as we know, fascism valued masculinity, virility, a certain conception of being male. So that's one reason. I would say perhaps a second reason is because female martyrs take a different form. And I have found within fascist era publications an emphasis on how the female, the ideal fascist woman, the ideal fascist mother is she who sends her sons to war and they die at war. So perhaps female martyrs, although they might not be called as such, are the martyrs who lose sons at war. And this is also reflected in the idealization of those mothers who lost sons to the First World War, like Mama Filzi, who then became, of course, a celebrity figure, an icon of the regime, traveling around, signing her photographs and photographs of her son across the country. So I think those would be two reasons why the fascist martyr is predominantly a man.
Yeah, I think the female, the mothers become sort of living martyrs, don't they? And a spectacle is made of them in that they're included often on the stage at fascist events as this kind of paradigm of willingness to sacrifice your most treasured thing in your sons, usually. So they're really, as you say, they become these icons that kind of tour around the country and things, which is fascinating to see. I've never come across any other female martyrs apart from Ines Donati, although I did read recently something about commemoration of the fascist dead in Ethiopia in the 35, 36, and how that sort of it was a sort of bigger category because Italian civilians living in Ethiopia were suddenly commemorated on a larger scale than they would have been back home. And I was reading about this woman who worked on a construction site. Italian woman in Ethiopia worked on this construction site that was attacked, and she, along with some other civilians, died. And her body was found kind of mutilated and semi-nude, and the fascist propaganda machine realized the power of this image, took photographs, and it was published back in Italy as a sort of example, again drawing attention to the barbarity of the opposition. And what's interesting there is she's often described as having a martyred body. So we see the language of martyrdom being applied to the kind of physical violence that was inflicted on her body, which is an interesting development there.
Yeah, I'm going to come back on what Hannah said there, because I think it's in the and thank you, Hannah, because you've confirmed what I was kind of thinking, but which is about Berta, because in the visual representations of Berta, but also in the reporting, one of the absolute key things is about his last moment, and it's the culminating moment of martyrdom as well. The moment that it actually happened is obviously the big moment, and he calls to his mum. So there are numerous. Every report, the reports are they're pretty standard. They sometimes they vary in sort of apportioning blame and responsibility, but almost every single one will finish with the fact that as he fell, he cried to his mother. There are visual images, paintings, and at the bottom they will have "Mamma" in big capital letters. It took me a while to sort of really to process that and think about what that was about, and I think it's absolutely about that, but also about, and then I think we get back into religious images about Virgin Mary. We get into images about Italy itself, which is l'Italia, the patria, being feminine, and I think yes, it is about the women are the martyrs because their sons will go and defend the country. The sons will also, they defend the country, which is a woman. So it's a kind of male protective gaze over Italy as well. And so consequently, what we need martyred mothers, because their martyrdom is not themselves, it's their sons and their husbands who will go off to war and will fight for the revolution or will fight in conflicts, and they have to bear that pain. So I think it's again a kind of, I think I'll come back to this idea of mass mobilization. Their patriotic duty is to take this pain, to suck it up, and then do their thing for the country, and let their sons go off. Let their sons go and do their patriotic duty. They are enabling them to do that. And we also see that in some of the writings and the memories of the squadristi, and they always write about how terrible they felt when they were out in the raids beating up communists and socialists, because they were worried that their mum was sitting at home worried about them, and would they come back, and what harm was going to happen to them. So there's a kind of two-way thing going on there as well. But I think it's really about that. It's quite interesting how they contrast with socialist women as well, and the dehumanization of socialist women in some of these conflicts that you read as well, even to the point that they're accused of cannibalism. So I think but yeah, I agree completely with your point.
Hannah?
Yes, I wanted to come in actually to unite both what Amy was saying and Simon was saying, but not under the heading of gender, but under the heading of Catholicism or Catholic models, because I think it's very interesting. Amy was talking about the martyred body. This focus on the body is really fundamental to how martyrs are represented, and it obviously reflects ideas of the bodies of martyrs being relics and being an important site for the construction of meaning. So one Catholic reference. The second Catholic reference is in what Simon was saying about the importance of the last words, so the last actions performed by the martyr, and these are always reported upon and probably completely, made up and completely invented. And this also derives from Christian models of the good death, that a good life can be seen in a good death, in dying well, the Christian art of dying that emphasizes the last words. And there are such good examples among fascist martyrs. One martyr in particular, who after being beaten to death had the strength to drag himself to an Italian flag and wrap himself within it. Others that repeat the words that were actually first reported to have been said by the Fratelli Bandiera, the Risorgimento martyrs, that upon dying, right before being executed, they shouted "Viva l'Italia!" And this is also reported to have been the last words of fascist martyrs. So quite a nice connection here of Catholicism and Italian nationalism.
Thanks, Hannah. Just to please put your questions in the Q&A if you've got any. I see one's already come in, but we'll come back to that in a minute. But participants, feel free to go ahead with questions now. Amy.
Yeah, one other thing to add on the body and the relic and the kind of links to Christianity. I think we really see that play out in this commemoration of transnational martyrs, whereby people who die abroad, who are black shirts living abroad, a lot of fanfare is made around the return of their bodies, the kind of repatriation of their bodies, even if they'd lived for a really long time in that place that they'd been killed. And I think that that's an echo from the Christian tradition of translatio in Latin, but translation. So there was a change that meant that hundreds and thousands of years ago, that meant that that relics or bodies of saints and martyrs were moved around in order to make new churches sacred spaces. So that kind of movement of the body and the relic, they were moved to spaces that had some connection to their lives, whether they'd grown up there or they'd had some experience in that city. There was a movement of bodies to bring them back to this kind of symbolic resting place. And this was a feast day, a kind of proper formal procession. And I think we really see that with the repatriation of the fascist bodies who die abroad, this kind of media coverage of the returns of the bodies as a way to kind of once again celebrate in a religious sense the Italian nation as their natural resting place. And we see things like, the work that I did on some who died in New York. We've got 50,000 people turning out to commemorate or to honor them in a sort of fake funeral in New York and proceed throughout the streets, and then a huge amount of effort put into kind of creating lots of rituals that happen on board the ship that brings them back to Naples, where there's another funeral for 150,000 people that proceeds through the streets of Naples. And even in Paris, there was a case of Nikola Bonservici, who was killed, I forget if it's 1924, 25, but he was killed in Paris. And again, we have a funeral there. But then there's this extraordinary kind of movement of his body on a train back to Italy, and lots of ceremonies with it stopping along the way, and a huge kind of handover, a ritualistic handover at the border from the French to the Italians. And lots is made of this being the journey of the body back to the homeland, and how the kind of blood of the martyr and the body of the martyr sort of fertilizes Italian ground, which really echoes the kind of Christian tradition of blood as this sacrificial source, and the power of the actual relic or the body.
And that's also obviously calling back to the unknown soldier processions, which was so important in after the war, not just in Italy, but in other places. They're kind of copying that as well. Simon.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the relics thing that Amy brought up there, and partly thinking about Berta. I mean, the issue with him is this thing about his hands as well. So it's partly coming back to the demonization, the brutality of the act of chopping his hands off, which isn't the case, because if you read the autopsy report, there's absolutely no mention of, there's various lacerations and bruises. They know what he had lentils for lunch that day, but there's no mention that he's had his hands chopped off at all. So this becomes very mythical, but his hands become the symbol of the local Gruppo Rionale, the local fascist party of the Giovanni Berta symbol. So hanging, literally these two hands kind of clinging to two blades of fascism. And as I said, there's this Gruppo Rionale. They organised in '34 an exhibition of his relics, of all the various bits and pieces they can find about Berta. And just thinking about the issue of relics, what Amy said, that made me think also about going back to the Risorgimento and thinking about the Museum of the Risorgimento and the presentation of Garibaldi there as well, where you've got the bullet from his ankle. I think there's his trousers laid out in the glass cabinet. I think even a fragment of bone there as well. Now I think again it taps back into this kind of tradition. We come back this tradition of martyrdom within Italy. So I think as a topic, it's something that people are really, really familiar with and dare I say kind of comfortable with. So it becomes a really useful communication tool.
There's quite a few questions, so I'd like to get to them. I just a couple of things to add to what's just been said. I'd say the wives were also very important to the martyrdom stories. The wife of Judo Gildani is always present. She's present at the trial. She's present. She's always referred to as well, and she's always in black, and his kids as well. So there's this kind of extended family. I would say that goes into the post-war martyrs around the Anni di Piombo, but also around partisans, which we had a question about that. Two people that I've come across, it's probably very little known actually, called the Cripper Sisters. And they get caught up in the anarchist Diana bomb in 1921 in a theatre in Milan, and they get their legs blown off. And they become very important martyrs for fascism as well. So there's a whole range of female martyrs that are not necessarily the traditional ones, but they're connected to, as you've said, in different ways, connected to the actual male martyrs, as it were. Not in the Cripper case, because their bodies are martyred, but they're not dead. Just on the last words and the last moments, I think this is so important to the story. It's something I can see there's a kind of another research project there, but Dino Grandi claims to have heard the last words of a fascist martyr in Modena whispered to him as the person died. Now, whether seems very unlikely and probably untrue, but it's a great story, right? So those kind of stories, being there when the martyr dies, you get the kudos of the martyr. And this was a Jewish one as well. So it's even more amazing story, that story of the Jewish fascist martyr in Modena. I'd like to come to the questions, and we've got time. I'd like to go to post 45, or actually 45 and afterwards, but I'm just going to give these questions to you, although can you all see them yourselves? If you can, actually the best thing would be if you could have a quick look at them and see if there's any, the participants can't see them, so maybe I should go to them. So I'm going to go for them all and then go back to you. It's a bit difficult, but see what you can answer. Peter Williamson, how far did the martyrs actually mobilize through sacrifice and the denigration of non-fascists? Do we know what impact their martyrdom had? And if so, in what way and who was influenced? That's quite a big series of questions. Feel free to answer whichever bit. It's a good question about the actual evidence of impact. Stephen Ostros talked about visiting the Foro Italico after 50 years experience in Rome. I was astonished to find how much explicit celebration of fascism of Mussolini said himself is still to be seen, including the Mussolini Dux obelisk. Does the martyrdom phenomenon appear within these fascist areas? Lindsay Maldari, I think it is talking about secular martyrdom, which we haven't discussed, is the memory of partisans and the resistance in the post-war period she's thinking of the Mausoleum of the Fascism in Rome, which is a fascinating series of monuments. Is there anything that the speakers could say about partisan martyrs and how that rhetoric compares with fascist martyrdom? And the last question from John Stewart: to what extent can the violence of fascist martyrdom be traced back to the widespread violence of ancient Rome, a major symbol for fascism, perhaps even to the assassination of Caesar? Does this help explain the specificity of fascism as Italian and give it historic legitimacy in fascism propaganda? Great questions. I'll just go back round again. Hannah, Amy, Simon. As I said, answer what you can, but I mean, the questions themselves are making very good points, but see what you can do.
Perhaps I could try answering some of the questions in order. So starting with Peter's question of whether this rhetoric of martyrdom actually worked, what real impact did it have? Well, that's a very hard question to answer, because you never know why people do the things they do. Like, what are their actual motivations? And what does motivate people? Well, self-interest, greed, fear. I think in this case, we can imagine, without strong evidence, but we can imagine that fear may play a role. And what we have been talking about, how images of martyrs, for instance, these photographs of fascist martyrs, all bloodied and beaten, that emphasize the brutality of the enemies, might have stoked fear of Bolshevism, fear of socialism, which, as we know, played a strong role in the ascent of the fascists to power. So impact. Foro Italico, I'm going to defer to Simon as the expert on that. I could talk about post-1945, post-fascist reinvention of ideas of martyrdom. What I find very striking about the Mausoleo delle Fosse Ardeatine in Rome is, if you think of this monument, which was the first major public competition to be launched after liberation, which was a real symbol of this new Italy, of a strong break with the past, the no longer fascist Italy. But yet, if you read the inscriptions at the Fosse Ardeatine, you can see how the vocabulary of martyrdom is still very much present. Although the forms of the monument themselves are it looks very differently from a fascist shrine of martyrs, for instance, this horizontal form, the use of concrete instead of stone. Some of the language of martyrdom is still there, but the difference is that we see the martyr represented no longer as a hero, but now much more as a victim. And I'll leave it at that so the others can jump in.
That Fosse monument or series of monuments is fascinating. I think we could talk about that. That could be a whole other event. But also it's a unifying symbol, isn't it, the martyr? This idea that this terrible thing has happened that's been incredibly divisive for so many reasons. Read Portelli's book. But this suggests that this is a moment of sacrifice and then renewal that's going to come afterwards. But I think it's a term that manages to kind of smooth over some of the more divisive elements around the memory of the Fosse dead. In terms of the partisans, I think what's really interesting with partisan martyr rhetoric is that there's this leap back to the language that was used around the risorgimento of martyrs for liberty, or of liberty. Which is a term that we don't see so much under the fascist regime. That's very much, martyrs per la patria. But we sort of skip back to the language that came before, relating to the national struggle for the good of the nation and to try and evict these kind of occupying forces from what is Italy's natural state. So that's something I think is really fascinating about how it returns after World War II, during the kind of civil war of the partisans and the fascists. What was the other one? I've forgotten. I might defer to Simon for the Foro Italico, but we also had a conversation before we started thinking about the presence of martyrdom, fascist martyrdom in public space today. And we were all kind of trading stories of our experiences in Predapio and watching the commemoration ceremonies that continue to happen today, and I'm sure are going on right now, for the March on Rome, and Mussolini's tomb being this kind of pilgrimage point. Lots of behaviours, you know, of the kind of religious celebration of the martyr figure when they move from Mussolini's tomb to the nearby church, and on all of those who gave their lives under fascism. So it's kind of still returning. And also in Rome, still today in the Verano Cemetery, it still stands, the the Mausoleum to the Fascist Martyrs. And what's fascinating there, that was constructed in 1933, I think. And that's where Inez Donati's body was moved to. But we see there's this plaque that honors the fascist martyrs, and names are being added of people who died in the 1970s. So there's this kind of, it's ever growing, this concept of fascist martyrs, and still visited by neo-fascists today. As I don't know, I'm not sure they're there to commemorate. I think they're there to kind of claim memory in public space as a sort of outward declaration that this is our heritage, but also perhaps another event.
Okay, where were we? Let me start with the Foro Italicos. You know, thankfully I've got an answer. Yes, there is. As you enter the stadium from in front of the Mussolini obelisk, so you walk down the Via dell'Impero, the Imperial Way. You have the blocks of marble on either side, and along on each side there are also 2 rows of mosaics. About halfway down there was one which is dedicated to Italy finally has its empire, so about the colonial conquest of 1935 to 36. Not so much a reference to martyrs, but obviously referring to the colonial conflict. But right next to that is a mosaic which is about the rise of fascism. It's about squadrismo. So it is a representation of the Fiat 18 BL truck that the squadristi used to go out into the countryside, specifically on their raids at the weekend. There are a number of squadristi on the back of on the truck with their little fez kind of hats. I think Menefrego is written at some point along the side of the truck, and on the floor in front of the truck is a guy who's been shot, and he's what's quite interesting thinking about it is that he's being held in the arms he's on the floor, and his comrade, his camarade, is next to him holding him, and so he's kind of slumped in his arms, and it's almost, maybe I'm stretching the point, but it's almost like a kind of Pietà image as well, as he holds his dying martyr there. I think there's also the Balila, the huge Balila statue as well, just as you move down towards the tennis courts, which is obviously what the whole project was about producing these young men who were going to go off and fight and die in these colonial wars. So yes. How did the fascist martyrs mobilize? The impact of that, yes, I mean, again, I would concur to Hannah on that. I think absolutely it's very difficult for us to tell. I think we have to think about, I mean, it's the big argument, the huge historical debate about consensus and where we go with that. But I think we have to think, yes, about pressures upon people. We also have to think about the encouragement of people to participate. So thinking about Berta, something we haven't got to, or we didn't get to, but the crypt, or John mentioned it, the crypt in Florence. There's an enormous parade at the opening of the crypt under Santa Croce, and the whole of the city turns out. They march the coffins from the Duomo in this huge circuitous route all the way around the city to come back to Santa Croce, and the streets are packed. Santa Croce Square is packed. So there is a great turnout. It's very difficult to say what does that actually mean. Some people would have been shipped in maybe from outside, from fascist organizations. It may have been a nice, an interesting day out. Some people certainly believed. Perhaps some people were coerced. I think it's very difficult. It's a good question. It's a really difficult question to answer. What was the impact of this? I think we can think about that. Maybe if we get to thinking about post-war, the post-war kind of memory of these people is one way of approaching it. What was the other one? The Mausoleum. Yes, again, I've got to concur to Amy on that, more or less everything she said there. What I would add is, I think it's kind of interesting there as well, is that the narrative of the Fosse Ardeatine is kind of, it's a bit like the way that the connection, the way that fascism creates its own narrative, because the Fosse Ardeatine narrative is effectively about this, about the partisans and the resistance being a national struggle. And that's quite debatable about whether it was a struggle that involved all Italians, and it comes back to talking about other histories of that conflict. But the way it's portrayed as a national martyrdom and a part of a national event and a national narrative. The question re ancient Rome and fascism, I wouldn't like to comment on that, honestly. I don't feel I can answer. I mean, obviously the regime has huge direct links back to ancient Rome, and I think something we've talked about quite clearly, the issue of martyrdom has great roots within Italy, and they may well go back to that period. But I think we possibly might need an ancient expert to give us a better answer on that one.
Thank you, all of you, for sterling efforts in answering the question. I've got one more, but I'll come back to that in a sec, because I wanted to, as kind of the last sort of theme, talk about what happens in 45, or when fascism finished. So that finishes in different places. Could be 44, could be 43, could be 45. And then, something on post-war fascist martyrs. So, I mean, just to start it off, it's the ones I've looked at, a lot of the monuments are completely destroyed on the moment of liberation. It's one of the first places no one's worked on this, as far as I can see. I mean, it's a complete area that needs research. It's often mentioned in articles about fascist martyrs. Oh, and the monument was completely destroyed. But there's no conclusions drawn from that. And one of the conclusions I might draw is that, which relates back to the question of impact, is actually a lot of people were really not that happy with these constant celebration of fascist martyrs and couldn't wait to smash out the fascist martyr monument, and wanted to celebrate their own martyrs, not just from the 43 to 45, but the ones going back to 1920, 21 and 19, and Matteotti. So, that is a little bit of an indicator of how much this was a propaganda effort and how much it actually went down into the people. We don't know for sure. There's a lot more work you can do, but that's one indicator, I think. So a lot of the monuments were destroyed, not the one in the Rome cemetery, but a lot of the other ones were smashed up. There's no trace of them at all. I've named you dozens of them that happened. So that's an interesting point. So I suppose my question would be, what happens to this huge cult that's been constructed over 25 years? What happens to it when fascism ends? And sort of supplementary question is, what happens to fascist martyrs post-war? And my provocative question, which on the today of all days would be, isn't Mussolini really, doesn't he take the place of all the others post, I suppose mostly post 57, but certainly post 45 to some extent? So that would be a three-part question, but I'll say whatever you like about fascist martyrs post at the fall of fascism and post fall of fascism.
Yes, there's so much to say in answer to the question of what happened to fascist martyrdom, what happened to this phenomenon, which, as Amy was saying, was very widespread in everyday life in Italy. It's for Italians living under fascism. I mean, did it just disappear from one day to the next? Well, I think what happened is quite complex, because we see on one hand how many of the objects and sites that represented fascist martyrdom are targeted in a series of spontaneous attacks against shrines of fascist martyrs, or in more systematic efforts to remove traces of these shrines. And I think one of the reasons why the shrines of fascist martyrs, as John was saying, tended to disappear more so than other traces of fascism, other types of monuments, other buildings, is because their primary identity was with fascism. They didn't have another identity, say, like the monuments to soldiers of the First World War that were created under fascism, which could fall back on a good identity. They could be reinvented. they were also useless in a certain sense. They didn't serve a practical function like a building might do. So I think that's one way in which this memory of fascist martyrdom disappeared. But the actual idea of martyrdom remained very much alive in Italian culture. And as we were mentioning before, with the commemoration of the martyrs of the resistance, of the partisans as martyrs, the rhetoric of martyrdom as a typically Italian tradition continues to exist, but transforms once again. It takes different vocabulary, it changes shape, but it remains to some extent still established on the same basis. So we see this rather paradoxical situation in which a very fascist type of martyrdom appears to be largely erased, but in fact, in reality, this Italian tradition of martyrdom shaped by fascism remains deeply ingrained within Italian collective memory and in Italian culture.
We also see some real symbolic melting down of monuments and recasting at, as statues to honor partisans, for example. So we see that with there was a monument to Ines Donati, who we've talked a bit about, and I believe her monument was destroyed and kind of recast as something associated with Italy's rebirth as a anti-fascist republic. Before I forget, I've got too many questions to hold in my head, but we were talking before about ancient Rome and the kind of links there. And one of the things that I've not done enough research on yet to sort of say this with much conviction, but tentatively propose that a lot of the visual representation of, or some of the visual representation of the martyrs who die abroad casts them as emperor figures. So you see some statues or busts that are built to the more prominent ones, where their hair looks a bit like a kind of laurel wreath, and there are kind of echoes of the representations of emperors, which I think is really fascinating in terms of upholding these figures as exemplars, to borrow Hannah's term there, that Italians living beyond Italy must follow. This is about spreading ideology beyond Italy's national borders in the hope that empire builds under Mussolini's regime. But as I say, I haven't done enough research on that to confirm it, but it's a fascinating thing that I'm finding traces of. And then in terms of commemoration today, what I think is really fascinating is that in the 70s, when we have this other great period of violence, Italians fighting Italians, we see this language of martyrdom recurring. And I'm reading some speeches given in 1973 to honor the Fratelli Mattei, who died during this arson attack that I mentioned in 1973. And they are immediately cast by the Movimento Sociale Italiano as martyrs for the party. And the language and rhetoric of martyrdom there is, you could have lifted it from the fascist textbook of the 40s and the 30s with some of Mussolini's speeches. So that borrowed language remains incredibly strong. That religious rhetoric, that commemorative culture persists into the neo-fascists of the 1970s and returns to kind of public commemorative practices there.
I'll stick with Berta. There's a lot to say kind of the post-war period. I think that the big issue is about the crypt. The crypt there is an appropriation of the crypt, so it is cleaned out. It's not done until about, I think it's 1950. The bodies, something I've not been able to find any. I've been digging around in the archive of the convent or the monastery which runs Santa Croce, and I've not been able to find any specific date of when and how that happens. It's very much kind of done quietly, very quietly. Many of the bodies just get taken back to their original grave. So Berta goes back to his original grave. He was originally buried in a family tomb up in San Miniato, just on the hill above Florence. And I've been up to there, and last time I went there, it was in a fairly shoddy state of repair. On the front of the tomb was a plaque which was originally on commemorating his death on the bridge. I know that got, which is a bit of something I was going to come to, but this was part of, I mean, his centenary of his death was earlier this year. So there were wreaths laid at the bridge. There were wreaths laid at the his tomb, or the family tomb was kind of given a clean up by volunteers. There was a wreath laid put at the stadium, and also at his family address. But in terms of the crypt, which is obviously very, very important for fascism, I think it's possibly the crypt, maybe. It's completely cleaned out. As I understand it, the one in Bologna has remained, however, which I think is Anna, you might be able to correct me on that, but I think that's remained. So there's something it's an interesting comparison there, is what's so controversial about the one in Florence, which is completely cleared out. If you go there now, where the fascist tombs were, there's just this long corridor. There are 3 plaques which were put there at the time to the Spanish Civil War, the colonial war, and I think that's about the Second World War as well. And there is also the kind of national military altar and commemoration. But where they were, the door is closed, so that gets completely cleaned out. But lots of the sort of material culture that tells this story is still around. I mean, as a cheap publication tool. I mean, for photos, I've been hunting around trying to buy up bits and pieces to put in the book, and there are numerous of these postcards which are still in circulation, medals, various books, magazines, but pages specifically of magazines dedicated to him, which people have cut out and sell. The drains, as I mentioned, remain. Very interesting drain right in the middle of the former Jewish ghetto, so right in the Via del Portico Ottavia, with the Fonda di Aberta. So you right in the middle of the ghetto from where the Roman Jews were deported. We have the commemoration of a fascist martyr. Quite interesting street names. There are still some Via Giovanni Bertas in Italy. The Casa Pound headquarters in Naples was the former Giovanni Berta MSI building, has maintained its name. So there's lots of this. Not to overplay. I think we're talking about a neo-fascist minority, but there's a reasonable, amongst those circles, there's a reasonable commemoration of him.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and that sort of that minority continues right through the post-war period, and then at some point, and I haven't studied this in detail, it intersects with people who've come back to government, and then it becomes much more acceptable. The minute, controversially, Milan Mayor Gabriele Albertini, at some point in his reign in the 90s, starts to go to the fascist graves and the partisan graves on the same day. But then we're into a whole probably well-worn and quite tired debate about that. But that's some of that memory surviving through the war, and now survives on the web in many cases as well, in different kinds of forms and different kind of areas. I'd like to go to the last 2 questions and then give you all a chance to sum up, and we've got a tiny bit more time. There's a sort of comment and question from Tommaso Zerbi, I think mainly for Hannah, but we could all think about it. He talks about his work on the Risorgimento and fascism and the link to Catholicism and the royalty and the royal family. But the question is about the changes to the celebration of fascist martyrs between the 20s and 30s, something also Simon talked about. Was there a change in the Catholic narrative, is his question, around that in the 20s and 30s? We talked about these creation of these sacrali. I don't know if that's what you're hinting at, but that's something that people might want to come back to. And Victoria Witowski, hi Victoria, has sent in a question, which is also linked up to what Simon's sort of looking for stuff on eBay. And, is there memorabilia relating to these fascist martyrs in circulation today in the public sphere? Who produced it? For what audience? Is it official? I suppose you could ask the question, is it old stuff or new stuff? Is there new stuff being produced around these martyrs, or is it simply the recirculation of old stuff? And just kind of my last point to think about, the kind of transnational comparative aspects. And I suppose something that springs to mind is the Franco memorial to the fallen outside Madrid, where Spain has kind of de-fascistized it to some extent. It's not really possible with that place without kind of blowing it up. I'm not advocating that, by the way, and British School at Rome is not advocating blowing up that monument, but and there are a lot of monuments blown up, by the way, as well, and not a place like Ireland would be really fascinating from this point of view. If you're going to talk about martyrs, you're really you've got your work cut out there. But I'm thinking of that, why Italy hasn't been able to do that, whereas Spain has actually moved Franco's body and is kind of is starting to depoliticize in some ways these places. That might be a final question. So say what you want, don't worry about answering these questions, but I'll give you one last round and then we'll wrap up.
I could try and answer Tommaso's question about how the Catholic narrative evolved in fascist martyrdom across the period we've been looking at. Well, of course, there is an evolution in the relationship between Catholicism and the regime, from the anti-clerical beginnings of the fascist movement, then to the alliance of the Catholic regime with the Catholic Church, the heights of which is, of course, the Lateran Pax, this marriage of convenience, which inevitably sours a bit because they were always going to be rivals, they were always going to be incompatible as totalitizing ideologies that wanted to control hearts and minds. So this arch is reflected in the evolution of ideas of fascist martyrdom. But fascist martyrdom can still be profoundly Catholic and manage to be both anti-clerical at the beginning and very clerical fascist or pro-Catholic at the beginning. Because in actual fact, the very clever thing about borrowing Catholic models is that there are two ways of doing that. On one end of the spectrum, you can be trying to replace replace Catholicism with nationalism. And this is what the anti-clerical elements of the Risorgimento do in their adoption of images of martyrdom. But you can also do it at the opposite end of the spectrum as a way of allying yourself to the Catholic Church, as a way of very much creating strong bonds with the Catholic Church. And that can be seen to be represented in the examples we mentioned of shrines of martyrs actually being placed in churches, as in Florence and at Siena. So although we see varying levels of closeness between the regime or the fascist movement and the Catholic Church, whatever degree of rivalry or closeness, martyrdom offers an excellent tool for the fascists at any level of that spectrum. And briefly, I'll also answer Victoria's question about circulation of images of fascist martyrdom. What can be quite fascinating is how the fascist martyrs remain alive today in a variety of media, particularly online. If you go look at the darker parts of the web at neo-fascist sites, they still celebrate martyrs. But also I've seen them in graffiti or on stickers on traffic poles. You can find them, similar locations. And John mentioned Irish martyrs, and I feel as an Irish woman I should mention how in San Lorenzo I actually came across graffiti celebrating the Arditi del Popolo, anti-fascist martyrs, right next to Bobby Sands. So just to emphasize how martyrdom is an extremely versatile, transnational and capacious political tool. And finally, and very briefly, to mention the transnational connections, the fascist use of martyrdom is a model for the Planck in Spain and later for Francoism, but also, of course, for the National Socialists in Germany. And we can see this in how the ritual of the roll call, of the appello, of the presente, is adopted both by the Spanish Falange and then later by the German Nazis, which I think again emphasizes how successful this tool was and how versatile, how easily transportable abroad. So that's all.
And sometimes we even see participation in respective ceremonies to honour those national martyrs from international figures that belong to these dictatorships abroad, which is this great moment of kind of transnational solidarity. And in terms of graffiti, as Hannah said, often there'll be a slogan about a fascist martyr that is put up in response to a slogan about an anti-fascist one, and we get this kind of engagement, this kind of fascist martyr battle that plays out in public space on walls and things. I think the question about memorabilia is really interesting, and certainly in the things that I've noticed, it tends to be those that had the more a death that could be described as a spectacle in some way that become the subject of memorabilia. So I'm thinking, well, obviously we have Berta, and he's got all these amazing depictions of his gory death in the bridge. But again, from the transnational perspective, Nikola Bonservici, who I mentioned, was honoured in Paris, and then they had this huge series of commemorative events as his train brought him back to Italy. He didn't die for, I think, 35 days after he was had a bullet in his brain, and he stayed alive, and that gave him 35 days to make these declarations of commitment to Italy, to the fascist regime, and imploring people to continue this struggle. And there's a very famous shot of him lying in his hospital bed with a bandage around his head, and a kind of, usually it's accompanied by a slogan about his commitment to fascism, even in this moment of prolonged agony. So I think we see those, the ones that have great stories tend to emerge in these in this memorabilia. And similarly, I've also seen examples of cards that bring together a whole collective of fascist martyrs, and they almost look like they're represented almost like Santini prayer cards, but all condensed into one space, which we see again the borrowing of the material culture associated with the Catholic tradition there. I hand over to Simon.
The memorabilia, which I think are kind of almost answered, but yeah, most of the, well, I think all of the stuff that I've found is original material, which is being recirculated. So I've not come across anybody remaking memorabilia about Berta. I wrote down something about the defascistization process. I think you mentioned it, John. My sense of it all is that it's very ad hoc. With all of these examples, I think it depends upon the place, it depends upon the authority over the place, it depends on the moment in many ways. It has obviously, recent years with the emergence of the new right in this country has obviously had quite an impact upon this as well. So one of the other bits of work I did recently with Nick Carter was to look at the huge painting, the mural painting of Mussolini in the Coney building, in the Italian Olympic Committee building, a huge mural painting, 12 by 14 meters across, with Mussolini in the middle, standing on an altar. And the way that this has been restored, and we see this, yes, works get, there is in the immediate post-war period, a period of epuration, of iconoclasm. And then there is a kind of almost a sort of forgetting and a moving on. And then we've got to the point where we start to see the appreciation of this. Now, I'm not for one, I think it's great. I love taking my students to the Foro Italico. I love walking around Rome and looking at all this stuff. I think it's great. But I think the problem is not so much that it's there. I think the problem is that it's about the context. It's about knowing what it says. And I go back to the Berta, I was quite taken aback when I made the connection with the Berta drain cover in the middle of the former ghetto. I think it's quite, it's quite interesting, and it touches on that question about impact as well. People walk over these drain covers; they're all over the city. I'm pretty confident, nobody sees them. If they do see them, they wouldn't have a clue what they are. So their impact is, I think, is debatable. But I think it is there this. I think what we've talked about here as well today, I think really it's about flexibility as well. I think that they're very flexible martyrs. And I come back to what Hannah's point was interesting about Bobby Sands, because there's a large mural of him in Garbatella, which is quite clearly associated with, well, it's on the side of the wall of the local former PCI building in Garbatella, but up on Monteverde, I've seen references to Bobby Sands, which are associated with the nationalist right as well. So they're very, very flexible. They're very flexible. They are used pre-fascism, they're used during fascism, and in the post-war period as well. So I think their flexibility is in many ways the key to what makes them so useful.
Thank you all so much. That was really great and so clear, and we covered a lot of ground. I'd just like to announce the next two events. On the 22nd November, we've got an event on everyday violence relating to fascism with a stellar lineup of Kate Ferris, Michael Ebner and Josh Arthurs. And then we've got on 16th of December an event on, which is kind of connected to some of the stuff we've been saying today, on squadrismo, after squadrismo, so in the post-war period, which is also very topical, given what happened in Rome very recently, in debates that emerged from that about whether that was fascism or not fascism, or hooligans or whatever. But, you know, just the spectacle of people invading the CGL in Rome was enough to make many people who've studied these things think immediately back to 1921, whatever the different context. It was very striking. So thanks to everyone, and thanks to everyone watching, and we'll see you hopefully in 3 weeks or so. Bye.